Imagine a childhood spent weaving ghost stories from forgotten headstones, dialing into storytelling hotlines just to hear a new tale and finding magic in the pages of books. Growing up in Central California, she was surrounded by folklore, family history, and an imagination that wouldn't quit, elements that now shape her award-winning stories. Her debut novel, Lupe Wong Won't Dance, tackled identity, activism, and representation with humor and heart, earning the Pura Belpré Honor. Then came The Last Cuentista, a breathtaking dystopian novel about the power of storytelling which won both the Newbery Medal and Pura Belpré Medal, marking a major milestone in her career. Blending sci-fi with folklore, reality with fantasy, and adventure with deep emotional truths, her books don't just entertain. They resonate, challenge, and celebrate the power of stories. Please welcome the creative force behind these unforgettable tales, Donna Barba Higuera. Hopefully I
You
said
got
that
my
last name
name
right.
right. So that was awesome. That doesn't happen often.
Your books are rich with cultural and emotional depth. Was there a childhood inspiration or favorite author who influenced your decision to become a writer?
This is a great question. I think a lot of times as writers, we always assume it's going to be another writer who inspires us or, a book. And those that did happen. And there were those books that happened for me. Um, I grew up in this tiny little desert town in Central California, and arguably there wasn't a lot going on, so we had to kind of create our own fun. Thus, I would sneak into the Pioneer Cemetery, which I wasn't supposed to, and make up stories with the headstones. But as far as a person, my parents were both teachers, and we didn't have a lot. But on the weekends, my mother would take me to our local library, and I was sure that that was where Mrs. Hughes lived because she was always there every time I showed up. And she was, she super magical person. She had this little puppet named Larry Library that I think was made out of a soup can. And she had created this little suit for him with this little straw hat, and he would tell stories alongside her. And she also had dial a story. And that was where I think an answering machine picked up and would tell a story. And I would run home from school and it would be 100 degrees and I'd be sweating by the time I got home, but I was just dying for those stories. And she gave them to me because I was in this town that, like I said, didn't have much going on. But she created in me a reader as well. My mother would take me on Saturdays to the library and I'd walk in, and she would always have this huge smile for me. And in a complicated little town, sometimes people like me and my family didn't always get smiles. But there was this woman who, Mrs. Hughes in the library, who always smiled and had a stack of books waiting for me. And those books are what helped my mind kind of create and leave this small town and go to other places. My imagination could explore other worlds. And she allowed me to dream of something bigger. But I do think I never would have, she created a reader in me. But I would never have become a writer or a storyteller without her because she helped foster my imagination. Um, and I have to say this, when I gave the Newbery speech, we write it out in advance, and I started thinking about just this question that you're asking me and who this was. And so I thanked her in my speech. And then after, I'm like, I wonder when she passed away, because she was older than me when I was a little kid. And so I'm like, okay, she would have to be close to 100. But I'm like, I just want to see if I can find her obituary and where she ended up. So I started searching and couldn't find anything. And then I went on, where all people go, Facebook, and I'm starting to search, couldn't find anything. And then a few months later, my high school calculus teacher, he would post these little comics, and somebody with the last name Hughes liked one of the comics. So I took a risk and I reached out. I knew I could embarrass myself, but I also knew maybe I could find out. And because this person was from this small town I was from, and it turns out it was her daughter. And she wrote me back, and I just said, I just want to know where your mom ended up, what she ended up doing. And, she had a big influence in my life. And she wrote me back and said, my mother is 97 years old and alive and well and sharp as a tack. And so I frantically put my books in envelopes and sent them to her and wrote her a letter about what she had given me. And it created this pen pal relationship across time. Like she knew me as a little kid. And she just wrote these really wonderful letters. And she's really was extremely sharp. Um, and she, so over the last few years, we had this wonderful relationship. And I'd written her a letter and was getting ready to send it a few weeks ago when her daughter emailed me that she had passed away. So that was really difficult, but I'm so glad that in the moment that it mattered, I did reach out. And I think that as kids, sometimes we look at adults for examples, and a lot of times adults tell us what to do. I felt like I've realized now that I didn't listen to what people told me to do. I went by their example and I watched how she treated others with kindness. And another great example for my child is Mr. Rogers. Like Mr. Rogers was just this huge character, not a character. He was this amazing human for a lot of us as kids, but we only saw him on TV. But he didn't tell us what to do. We got to see how he treated others, who he invited into his home, and that example, I think, is what formed a lot of us of that era. But that was what Mrs. Hughes was to me, just an example. And now I don't want to tell somebody what to do because I just said people should lead by example and not tell people. But if I could tell people what to do, go tell a teacher or an educator or a neighbor or a librarian what they've done for you as a child. If there's somebody like that for you, because it was such this amazing reward for me in my life that I did that. And it could have been embarrassing, but it turned out to be this awesome experience in my life.
Wow, that must have been so cool for you to be able to, be able to be pen pals with your basically your idol.
Yeah.
In the last Gwen setup, Petra's storytelling preserves the past for future generations. Do you think about stories from today that need to be preserved for our future generation?
Mm. So I think we have this tendency to fall back on the classics all the time, like books that are 100, 200 years old. And even when I go do school visits now for kids and they'll tell me how, they'll say, "Oh, I really liked your book and I'm a writer too." And I'll say, "Well, okay, you need to go write and do better than I did." And I think that we need to know when to pass the baton to the next generation and let that happen. We just need to recycle the those classics a little bit. And I want kids who are out there now. I don't even know if you're a writer, but if you are, your books need to be on the shelves. We need to kind of like move onto the next generation. It's okay to change. But if I had to choose, I would say I look at people who I go, oh, these are master storytellers. And for me, younger, I would say Ursula K. Le Guin. I love, fantasy sci-fi. So I think all of these authors fall in that category because that's what I love to read. Octavia Butler, little dark. Some of her stuff is dark, but it's again, a lot of it shows how we should treat others and who we should be. They don't feel like they're preaching to kids. And I think recently, Daniel Nairi, Everything Sad is Untrue, is this book that allows people to step into the life of someone else, someone who has a different experience than their own. And it's just so masterfully done. And when I first started reading it, I was like, I don't know, the format is different. It's not kind of the Western method of storytelling, but once I was it, and now I give it to everybody, and people will tell me, "Oh my gosh, that's the best book I've ever read." So if you haven't read any of Daniel Nairi's, and he has written other books like The Many Assassinations of Samir the Storyteller, I think. But anyway, just awesome author. But you asked specifically about storytelling, and I think we need to not forget the oral tradition of storytelling. And in the Last Cuentista, It's specifically about this girl who's battling this evil cabal who's trying to erase story and erase storytelling. And she retells the ancient folklore and mythology that's been passed down from her grandmother. She retells it in a way that makes sense to what's going on in her life. And in this case, sci-fi. So it's a girl going across space. And so she retells these stories in a way that makes sense to her with what she's going through. And I think that's kind of how I envision preserving our stories. I think that we need to make the allowances for the reader and the next generation of storyteller to take the myths and the folklore and make it their own.
Your characters often navigate identity and cultural differences. How have your own experiences growing up in a biracial influenced these themes?
So I've even had family members, like it's tricky, for people who are navigating different races and different cultures, because you'll even have family members who will say, well, you're not 100% this, or you're not this percent of this. People try to put things in boxes and they need to categorize. And it was hard as a kid, and even now as an adult, I've had family members say things, and I'm like, well, I'm actually both of those things. You don't get to take away who I am just because you can't put me in a specific box. You don't slice them down the middle, and I think that's really short-sighted, and it's hurtful to those of us who are all the things that we're comprised of. So when I do school visits, I get to meet those kids who are like, oh, my mom is this and my dad is this, and they understand navigating two cultures. And when I wrote, my kids are also Chinese American, and when I wrote Lupe Wong Won't Dance, it was a departure from, sci-fi and mythology and the other things I like. But my daughter came home from middle school and one day, and she was upset because she was going to have to square dance in PE. And I just thought it was so funny. I was like, wait, they're still square dancing in PE? And then she's like, yeah, I don't understand why. Like, it doesn't really represent, I don't know anything about that. And so that night I started writing this character, Lupe Wong, who my kids too have like kind of this Latina first name and a Chinese last name. And so I was like, I'm going to make this character that is my daughter, but she says and does all the things that I didn't do at that age, or my daughter didn't do because we were too nervous or too afraid to speak up. My daughter was kind of shy at that time, not anymore. But so I created this character who makes mistakes and has to learn how to navigate friendships and ask for forgiveness and forgive others. But it's also, she's this girl who does it. She's kind of a sporty girl. She plays baseball, and it ended up it won the Sid Fleischman Award. I don't know if you mentioned it, but for the funniest book of the year. So people like go from, wait, you went from funniest book of the year to, the Newbery medal. I mean, they're very different tones. Like one book is serious and kind of sad, and the other one's funny. But there's humor in navigating two cultures. And I kind of wrote this dinner scene, and my kids, when they read it, thought it was hilarious. It was like having the Chinese grandparents and the Latina grandmother at the table. And they're, kind of these dueling grandmothers of who has the best food and who's going to give what. And so, but there are challenges with navigating two cultures as well. And I think a lot of that comes from people on the outside who don't understand. It's a different experience than their own. And so this book is a little bit about that too, like letting people have this window into Lupe's world and hopefully understand what it feels like, to navigate multiple cultures. But some of it's based in my own experience, but also my daughter's. And I continue this with the Last Cuentista when she's, she talks about, and it was my experience with her mother not understanding her grandmother's culture, and that's a real thing that that people who grow up that way, and you have to kind of code switch, and one scenario you're one thing and you may speak another language even. But I think it's important for kids to see themselves in those stories. And I thought it was so unusual Lupe Wong. I'm like, okay. And then I had a woman reach out to me and she goes, my name is Lupe Wong. And I'm like, what? Like, what are the odds? So there is a Lupe Wong adult. And she's like, this book is so much my experience. So that is important to me that we're writing those books.
Your books have given many young readers the chance to see themselves reflected in ways they may not have before. Have you had any memorable interactions with readers that reminded you of why these stories matter?
Okay, so when I was a little girl, my grandmother, she lived in the middle of the desert in the middle of the oil fields in Central California. And this wasn't uncommon. There were families who lived there. But when I would go to bed, every once in a while, she would go, go to bed, or El Cucuy is going to come get you, or eat your dinner, or El Cucuy is going to come eat you. And I'm like, okay, how are you supposed to sleep or eat when you've got this threat of El Cucuy?
Wait, is El Cucuy like a myth?
Yes. Well, is he? Um, he's the Mexican boogeyman. And it's funny because talk about like different cultures. Like I was like, I can't tell my like white American friends at school about El Cucuy because they can't handle that because he's like hairy and has bloody fangs and claws and his eyes glow. At least that was my grandma's version. And I'm like the American boogeyman. Nobody knows what he looks like. He kind of lives under the bed. He might tickle your toe or whatever. And like the El Cucuy is like scary. And so when I was learning to write picture books, there was a writing prompt and it said, take the thing that scares you the most as a child and make it adorable. And so I'm like, okay, that's a huge ask because El Cucuy, there's no way to make El Cucuy adorable. He's horrifying. But I wrote a book about it, about a boy. It was based on one of my cousins who had moved from Mexico. His name was Ramon, and how he was afraid. He was afraid of the way he spoke. He was afraid of the way he dressed, and he was nervous about starting school. And so I wrote about how suddenly this boy, Ramon, is not afraid of El Cucuy anymore. He's more afraid of these other things that can happen. I was at a school visit, and oftentimes the picture books I read to kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and then the middle grade, it goes up from there. And so I was reading this book, and this little Latino boy goes, I know El Cucuy. And when I was a kid, I thought I was the only one with an El Cucuy until I was older. I'm like, oh, he's real. My grandmother wasn't just making up this creature
Wait, you said
standing
El
next.
Cucuy is real?
Well, to me he is, but he's my okay. It's so in Latino folklore and mythology, there are a lot of things that like run under the surface and you don't know if they're real or not. Like to me, it was very real. But others are like, okay, that's totally made up. But I don't know. But when I talk about it at school, this little boy came up and he goes, I have an El Cucuy. And I was like, you do? So to him, it's real. Like we all had kind of, not all of us, I did, had imaginary friends, or we really had big imaginations where these creatures were very real. And to this little boy, it was real. And his little friend who wasn't Latino came up and he goes, he's listening to his friend talk, and his friend's like, yeah, I have an El Cucuy. And this friend says, I want to get me one of those. And I was like, no, you don't. But it was so funny to me because it allowed this book, like where I wasn't able, I was too afraid to talk to kids about it. Now we've got this kid who's talking about it. There's one other instance. This one was a little more powerful to me personally. It wasn't as funny. It was just really, as a writer, I was in Berlin at the International Book Festival, and for a few days in a row, I was speaking to all of the middle schoolers in Berlin. They would all come to this festival, and so there were thousands of kids in this huge lecture hall. It was really intimidating, but but it was more interactive. A lot of times when I speak, it's just me talking. People want speeches, and I'm like, well, I love their format because they would stop in the middle and kids could get up and talk and ask questions or tell a story. And I love that format because everybody feels involved. And at one point I was talking about El Cucuy and boogeymen across the world and how we all have, there's a boogeymen in all cultures. And this young boy in the far back, he stands up and they bring him the microphone. And I see all his classmates and his teacher kind of looking at him. I'm like, oh, that's strange. And he said, my parents my mom is from France and my dad's from Syria, and they both argue about how they have better boogeymen, like theirs is scarier than the others. And I just thought it was kind of funny. And I was like, yeah, that's what it's, we all think we have the best boogeyman. And then I was signing books afterwards, and it was, this long line because there was all these kids, thousands of kids. And a teacher or an adult came up at one point and she said, I need to tell you something. She said, the young boy who stood up and told about his parents. And she reminded me, and I said, oh yeah. And she said, it surprised us all. And I said, yeah, I was wondering because you all kind of like suddenly looked over when he took the microphone. And she said, he never talks. He never speaks in class. And it was this moment where it just gave me goosebumps. And she goes, something about what you said gave him permission to tell his story. And he was so strongly wanted to share his personal story that he stood up in front of thousands of people. Like that's into, I was really nervous and scared. And here's this young man who, he was probably, I don't know, 11, maybe 10, and stood up in front of all these people and shared his story. And that's the power of story. I think we need to remind ourselves as writers that there are those kids out there who may not talk or often, but you're reaching them and it allows them to think of their own stories.
Yeah, that's kind of cool in a way. So I guess he saw a representation himself and within you.
I think so, or a connection. And I think you probably hear that a lot from writers because we all experience it where we think we're writing something that's very personal, but it ends up allowing us to connect in a way to others that we never dreamed possible.
Donna, in your interview with PEN America, you spoke about the rise in book bans, especially those affecting authors of color. What do you think this means for the literary world, and how do you see your role in pushing back against these challenges?
Boy, I mean, this is such it what's happening is so baffling to me. I think that the challenges are coming from people who are trying to erase an experience that is something other than their own. For some reason, they don't want to delve into someone or learn something about someone else who has a different life experience. I've been told in my writing that it was subversive, and I didn't really understand what that meant. And so I looked it up, and it says it's troublemaking and inflammatory and insurgent. And I was like, oh my gosh, I would never have read my book and thought that. But then I realized that my books just are asking questions for the readers to ask themselves. And I think that it kind of sparks something in a lot of readers. I try not to tell anybody anything, but just ask the questions so that they can look within themselves. And there are readers who don't want to do that. They don't want to look within themselves. They're so comfortable in their own little corner that they don't want to learn anything about another culture or another people. It's hard for them to have empathy. So in the Last Cuentista, writing about this evil cabal who wants to erase story, people asked me after the book came out because the timing of it, there were not book bans happening when I wrote it. And so afterwards, when it won the Newbery and people were reading, they're like, oh my gosh, how did you know? How did you know that this was going to happen? And people were going to be trying to erase stories. And my answer was, I didn't know that this was going to happen. I was just writing about the thing that's frightened me the most because I love story so much. And I love reading about other people's experiences and hearing about other people's experiences. It's what's most important to me. And it's really tricky because it's scary. It's a little scary because history has shown us that the people who want to erase stories, they always end up on the wrong side of history. And we always look back and go, wow, that was really bad and that was really scary. And so those of us who are trying to protect that, we have to ask ourselves, okay, how do we do that? Like, how do you do that with and still feel safe while you're doing it? It sounds kind of dramatic, but it's true. For me, it's just important to establish connections with other people. I think that it's kind of like traveling. Books let us grow when you go to other places and meet other people. It's the same with books. and books let us travel to places we've never been. I think of this really, there's this famous Mark Twain quote, which is, travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all of one's time. And I think of those who are just so hell-bent on banning books or challenging books. This kind of equates to them. Like, go travel. I feel like they haven't traveled in the mind of reading and books. But those types of people who, some of them tend to be in certain regions, they've existed before in history. I think those of us who are nervous because we know sometimes it can be a scary place. My role is I owe it to Mrs. Hughes of the world. I owe it to people like her to fight in the way that I can. And for me, that's by writing. And if by writing that means, I'm apparently subversive, then so be it. I'll keep writing, and that's my way of trying to fight the good fight.
Stories have the power to shape how we see the world, connect us to our past, and inspire the future. Through her writing, she reminds us that storytelling isn't just about entertainment, it's about preserving voices, honoring culture, and imagining possibilities beyond the stars. Whether she's making us laugh with Lupe Wong Won't Dance or taking us on an interstellar journey of memory and resilience in the Last Cuentista, her work challenges us to think, feel, and dream. As the landscape of literature continues to change, authors like her play a crucial role in ensuring that diverse voices are heard, celebrated, and protected. We're grateful for the stories that she's shared and the ones that are yet to come. Thank you, Donna Barba Higuera.
Thank you, Christopher. And it was a pleasure to meet you and to hear a little bit about your story too before we started. And yeah, go tell your cuentos also.